The first blow hit her right in the chest, not physical, but the kind that steals your breath and shrinks the world down to the size of a single white envelope on the kitchen table. Emily stood frozen, fingers digging into the countertop as if afraid the floor might vanish beneath her. And maybe it would. Because inside that envelope wasn't just a letter. It was a bomb. Her father, the man whose name she'd whispered with reverence and pain since childhood, had filed a lawsuit against her. For custody of her own daughter. "He's serious," she whispered, eyes locked on the signature. Richard Madison. Her ex-husband stood by the sink, silent, lips pressed into a thin line. He'd known. He'd known all along. "He came to me a week ago," Mark finally said. "Said you're unstable. That you've lost control since the divorce. That Sophie needs a real home." Emily let out a short, humorless laugh. "And you? Did you agree?" "I can't get involved, Em. She's not my daughter." She lifted her gaze slowly. There were no tears. Only ice-cold resolve. "Then I'll make sure he regrets this for the rest of his life." Richard Madison had always known how to smile beautifully. His smile was a weapon, warm, deceptive, capable of lulling even the most suspicious people into complacency. He wore Brooks Brothers suits, drank coffee with almond milk, and attended church every Sunday. To the public, he was the ideal father and philanthropist. But Emily knew the truth. She'd known it since she was 7, the first time he'd struck her for breaking his favorite cup. Not the one in the kitchen. The porcelain one with the gold rim, gifted by his second wife. The one who'd left when Emily was 13. Now, 30 years later, he was back, not in her life, but in her child's. Sophie was 11. Smart, sensitive, with wide brown eyes that reflected the same pain Emily once carried. "Grandma said Grandpa wants me to live with him," the girl said a few days later, sitting on her bed with her knees pulled to her chest. Grandma. Richard's mother. The woman who'd spent years pretending not to see the bruises on her daughter's arms. "And what did you tell her?" Emily asked, forcing calm into her voice. "I told her I'm not going anywhere." "But," Sophie paused, eyes on the floor. "He gave me a puppy." Emily closed her eyes. Of course he had. A puppy, a bike, a trip to Disney World. Richard had always bought love. Because he'd never known how to earn it honestly. The court date was set for 6 weeks away. Emily knew her chances were slim. She worked part-time as a nurse, lived in a modest house on the edge of town, and drove a used Honda. Richard, on the other hand, owned 2 companies, a lakeside home, and accounts in 3 banks. Judges loved stability. And to them, stability meant money. But Emily wasn't giving up. She started digging. First, her mother's old letters, hidden in a box in the attic. Then school records, medical files, neighbor testimonies. Then newspaper archives. And one night, scrolling through microfilm at the local library, she stumbled upon a 1998 article. Businessman Richard Madison accused of fraud in government contracts. The case had been dropped for lack of evidence. But his partner's name, Clive Henderson, remained in the records. Emily found Clive on LinkedIn. He lived in Arizona and worked as a gardener. And, as it turned out, he still remembered Richard. "He threw me away like a bag of trash," Clive said over the phone, his voice trembling with rage. "I spent 3 years in prison while he walked clean. Thousands of people lost their pensions because of his schemes. Are you willing to testify?" "I am. And I'm not the only one." The trial began on a rainy morning. Richard looked impeccable. Dark suit, neat part, confident stride. He hugged his mother, nodded to the judge, and smiled warmly at Sophie when she entered the courtroom. Emily sat perfectly still. Inside, she was shaking, but on the outside, she was ice. Richard's lawyer spoke first, smooth, self-assured, with a voice that made you want to yawn. "Miss Carter," he began, addressing Emily, "you claim your father has a history of aggressive behavior. Yet there's not a single police report, medical record, or credible witness to support that. This is nothing more than personal resentment." "It's no more," Emily replied calmly, "than his attempt to use my daughter as a weapon of revenge because I left his life." "Miss Carter," the judge interjected, "please stick to the facts." So Emily handed a folder to her attorney. Let the truth begin. First came Clive Henderson. Then the neighbor from the street where they'd lived in the 90s, the woman who'd seen Richard shove his wife out of the car. Then the school counselor who'd documented a conversation with 10-year-old Emily in which she'd spoken of her fear of her father. The recording had been archived, but under juvenile protection laws, it still held legal weight. And finally, the recording. Emily had made it a week earlier. She'd pretended she wanted to talk things through. Met Richard at a cafe. Turned on her recorder. "You were never a good daughter," he'd said. "And now you want to take the last thing from me? My own blood?" "I'm not your blood," she'd replied. "I'm your victim." "Victim?" He'd laughed. "You chose this yourself, stuck with that loser Mark, his dingy apartment, his empty promises. You can't give Sophie what I can." "And what can you give? Money? Fear? An empty house and an empty soul. Order. Discipline. What you never had." That word, discipline, echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. It had always been his code word. The phrase he used before every punishment. The judge frowned. The silence stretched for an eternity. The judge flipped through papers, glancing occasionally at Sophie, who sat beside Emily, holding her hand tightly. "Mr. Madison," the judge finally said, "given the evidence presented, including a documented history of aggression, manipulation, and a recent attempt to bribe a minor, I see no grounds to transfer custody to you." Richard paled. "But I'm her grandfather. And that's exactly why you should understand, love isn't bought. Especially not a child's." She turned to Emily. "Custody remains with the mother. All visits are supervised only." When they stepped outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight peeked through the clouds. Sophie hugged her mother. "Did you win?" "No," Emily whispered. "We just survived." But for the first time in years, she felt something new. Hope. Richard didn't give up. He filed an appeal. Then a countersuit for defamation. Then a complaint to the medical board, claiming Emily was unfit for her nursing job. But now she had allies. Clive gathered a group of Richard's former victims. Neighbors signed a petition. Even Richard's mother, the one who'd stayed silent for decades, showed up at Emily's door one day. "I can't anymore," she whispered, clutching the doorframe. "I saw what he did to you. To your mother. Forgive me." Emily invited her inside. Slowly, like a sprout pushing through concrete, the family began to heal. 6 months passed. Emily got a promotion. Mark returned, not as a husband, but as a friend and support. Sophie laughed more often. And Richard? His business collapsed after a local reporter revived the old fraud case. His name now drew whispers and condemnation. The last time Emily saw him was at his brother's funeral. He stood alone, fists clenched. She walked over. "You don't deserve to be a father," she said. "But you'll always be my lesson." He didn't answer. Now, every morning, Emily brews coffee and sits on the porch. Sophie sits beside her, reading or drawing. Sometimes they're silent. Sometimes they laugh. And in that silence, in that laughter, in that ordinary morning light, lies their victory. Because family isn't a perfect house or a bank account. It's protection. Even when you have to fight for it with your teeth.